All living things have certain characteristics or processes that distinguish them from non-living things. In the human, those processes include metabolism, which is the sum of all chemical reactions in the body, so breaking down things chemically and building things back up chemically. For example, when we take food into the body, we have to break it down chemically into its smallest pieces so that we can then use those small pieces of proteins and fats and carbohydrates to build new body structures. The human body has to be able to respond to the environment around it and to affect change when that change is needed. So we have to be able to detect changes in temperature both inside the body and outside. We have to be able to respond to painful stimulus and to the stimulus that our belly's empty and growling and that we're hungry. We have the process of movement, which is not only important in moving the human body from one place to another, but probably even more important in that we have to move things through the human body. Blood has to move through the human body to transport oxygen and nutrients. White blood cells have to move through the human body in order to travel to the different areas of the body to make sure that they're destroying all these bacteria and viruses that try to come in to infect us and to break down old cells. The human body has to be able to grow. When I say grow, I don't just mean to grow from a one-celled zygote into a full-grown adult, but I also mean that we have to be able to grow new cells and new tissues when we have injuries and just to maintain the body. Differentiation is a process by where cells that are non-specialized become specialized. For example, in the bone marrow, there are stem cells that are blood stem cells. Stem cells are cells that are undifferentiated. That means they don't yet have a job to do. So those cells, under certain chemical conditions, hormones and growth factors and different things, will cause those stem cells to create red blood cells or white blood cells or platelets. So the cells that are stem cells differentiate into specialized cells. And then finally, the human body has to have the process and the characteristic of reproduction, reproducing not only the species by creating offspring, but reproducing body cells so that we can grow and maintain new body tissues and constantly build new structures. Anytime that any of these processes doesn't work as it should, it can lead to cell death and tissue death, and ultimately, of course, to death of the body. So we have a very tightly regulated equilibrium or balance in the human body, and maintaining that balance is a process known as homeostasis. When we're looking at homeostasis of body fluids, this, of course, is going to be vitally important because we have nutrients and gases and hormones and all these things that the body needs to maintain life are being transported in body fluids. So survival of the body is dependent on maintaining those fluids. So this looks a little bit complicated, but it's pretty easy to understand. It's simply showing us how body systems are working together. So we're bringing oxygen into the respiratory system and then getting that oxygen into the cardiovascular system so we can transport it out to body cells. In the process of using that oxygen to make energy, our body cells are going to create some waste products that we put right back into the cardiovascular system. The digestive system brings food in. We break it down into its smallest little pieces, its nutrients, which are then sent right into, I'm sorry, my computer keeps pulling that screen up, goes right into the cardiovascular system where all those nutrients are then going to be transported out to the body cells so that they have the fuel and the nutrients and the oxygen and all the hormones and everything that are needed in order to create new body structures. Once all this is done, then we have the urinary system, and the rest of the digestive system are going to filter things out. So waste products that the body can't use will be filtered from the cardiovascular system through the urinary system and excreted in the urine. And the solid waste products that we can't use will be excreted through the digestive system. So all of this is moving through fluid-like environments throughout the body. So maintaining that fluid balance is one of the most critical and one of the most vital types of homeostasis in the human body. Controlling homeostasis requires that we have a feedback loop. Most of our homeostatic mechanisms in the human body work very similar to the way your thermostat works in your house. So there's a controlled condition, temperature, if we're talking about, the thermostat in your house, of course. So there's a controlled condition that is detected by receptors. It's monitored to make sure that that temperature stays right. Once it becomes too hot or too cold, then a stimulus is going to be sent to the control center. The control center then kicks on the heat or kicks on the air conditioning that brings a response to whatever caused that initial signal. So if it got too hot in the house, then the thermostat's going to detect that. The control center kicks on the air conditioner until the temperature gets back to the controlled condition of 70 degrees. So the response was because of the particular stimulus. So homeostasis, normal controlled condition, returns once the effector, the air conditioner, has gotten the temperature back right. So that's a classic example of negative feedback. The response was caused by the stimulus to get the condition back to normal. So let's look at an example of how that works in the human body. So remember, when we're talking about negative feedback, there are certain things that we have to have as a part of this. So we have to have a receptor to detect a change, a control center that determines what needs to happen, and then the effectors which cause an action. Okay? So let's say that we're looking at the controlled condition of blood pressure. So the stimulus is homeostasis was interrupted by increased blood pressure. Okay, so blood pressure went up. We have receptors in some of our blood vessels that are called baroreceptors. Baroreceptors detect changes in pressure. So nerves that are attached to those blood vessels detect that stimulus, pressure increase, sends that stimulus to the brain, the control center. So the information is sent to the brain. Okay, blood pressure has raised. The brain then puts into motion a pathway through nerve impulses that is going to cause the heart rate to decrease. Okay, when the heart rate decreases, there's less blood being pumped out. So there's less blood in the blood vessels at any given time. That decreases the pressure. Okay, it can also cause dilation of the blood vessels, which makes the blood vessels larger. If the blood vessels are larger, then the blood is pushing less against those vessels. So that also decreases the blood pressure. So by decreasing the heart rate and dilating those blood vessels, that decreases the blood pressure. So the response was changing the heart rate, changing the blood vessels so that blood pressure gets back to normal. So those baroreceptors now detect the controlled condition of blood pressure is back to normal, and they stop sending that stimulus to the brain. Okay, so most of the mechanisms in the human body are controlled by negative feedback, such as you saw there with the control of blood vessels or the control of blood pressure. There are a few conditions that are controlled by what is known as positive feedback. Now, think back to negative feedback again that we just covered. There was a stimulus. The body set something into motion that detected the change and then worked to get the body back to normal. Okay, that's negative feedback. Change causes a response. Response gets the condition back to normal. Okay, with positive feedback, there's a stimulus, there's a response that increases the stimulus, which increases the response, which increases the stimulus, which increases the response. Yeah, I know it sounds confusing, but let's walk through this and I think you'll understand. Okay, so one of the easiest positive feedback mechanisms to understand is what happens with labor contractions in a pregnant woman when delivery is imminent. So the uterus is where that baby is developing. And at the bottom of the uterus, there are a lot of stretch receptors. Those stretch receptors are nerve cells that detect when the uterus is being pushed on even more and stretched even more. So as that baby gets bigger and bigger and it gets closer and closer to time for delivery, that baby is pushing more and more and more on the cervix. Okay? So pushing more and more and more on the cervix causes those nerve impulses to be sent to the brain. The brain then sends out a hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin targets the uterus and causes the smooth muscles in the uterus to contract. As that uterus is contracting, it's pushing more and more and more on that baby and pushing it further and further down on the lower part of the uterus, on the cervix, where all those stretch receptors are located. So those stretch receptors are going to be stimulated even more. Once they're stimulated even more, it's going to send that stimulus right back up and interpreted to the brain, which sends out more oxytocin, which causes more contraction. That stimulus is going to be detected, sent right back to the brain, which sends more oxytocin, which causes more uterine contraction, which causes more stretch, which is sent to the brain, which releases more oxytocin. So I think you get the idea here, right? The increased stretching of the cervix causes more and more and more oxytocin to be released, which causes the uterus to contract more, which causes those stretch receptors to be stimulated more. Get the picture? All right, so how does all this stop? Giving birth to the baby. Of course, once that baby's out of the uterus, it's no longer stimulating those cells in the cervix, so the release of oxytocin stops. Pretty cool, huh? Yeah, you'll get more of that as we continue to go. But do you see the difference in negative feedback and positive feedback? Remember, negative feedback, the stimulus is interpreted by the control center, which causes an action that gets things back to normal, okay, back to that controlled condition. With positive feedback, the stimulus is detected by the nerves, sent to the brain causes an action, which causes even more stimulus, okay? All right, so homeostatic imbalances can result in disease or disorder or death, depending on what the imbalance is. The human body is going to work to try to fix those imbalances, to try to get things back to normal. But sometimes the imbalances are continuing to occur and disease and disorders do develop, and of course that can lead to death if the body is unable to get you back to normal. For instance, high blood pressure. If the slowing of the heart rate and the dilating of the blood vessels can't lower the blood pressure enough, that blood pressure is going to continue to have all the detrimental effects on the cardiovascular system that could result in a heart attack. So the body tries to fix it, but it can't. There are many things that can affect the way that our body is able to maintain homeostasis. Of course, the genes that you're born with can determine how your body works and how your body is made. The air that you breathe and the food that you eat and the stress that you have can all affect the way that your body is able to respond and able to maintain homeostasis. All of those things bring, if you think about, well, not all of those things, let me rephrase that. So the air that you breathe, the food that you eat, things that you take into your body can affect the chemical makeup of your body, especially if you're taking in a lot of carcinogens or cancer-causing agents. The stress, the way you think, the way that you're feeling can cause hormones to be released that cause stressful situations that increase blood pressure. So there are some things that we can control and other things that we can't. So the more that we do to try to maintain normal homeostatic balances and good health, the better off we'll all be. Yeah, I know, I had to get on my soapbox there for a moment. Okay, so we're going to move now into some anatomical terminology. So before we begin this, I believe I will pause this video and begin a new one.